This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thanks very much for the invitation. I've been really looking forward to this, especially as it's coming towards the end of a long, hard term of teaching. It's kind of nice to sit back and think about research again. So many thanks for the invitation. And as you'll have guessed, my background is within geography, specifically cultural and historical geography. And what I'm going to try and do today over the next kind of 40-45 minutes is to combine two publications or the central argument from two publications. And I've got hard copies here if anyone wants to take a copy of those. And these ideas are really at the heart of my PhD that I finished a few years ago. But the ideas are things that I continue to think about today in relation to subsequent projects on the Woodcraft Folk and the Jewish Lads Brigade. And at the kind of centre of these investigations are questions about how British youth movements constructed and maintained youth citizenship training projects, and then how young people engage with, subscribe to, or in some cases subverted those projects through their everyday embodied actions. And often this kind of focused on identity, so issues of gender, race, politics, and religion. And in making those connections, I've been kind of able to argue that it's made a contribution to geographical literature because identity is a core feature of social and cultural geography. And over the last 20 years, the emergence of something called children's geographies as a sub-discipline of that has stressed the importance of exploring the everyday life worlds of children and young people. However, very little historical work takes place within children's geographies. There's been a few studies about schools, the work of Teresa Plajaska, and studies around the playground movement in the US by a geographer called Liz Gagan. But ultimately, in my early career, I've been trying to examine some spaces beyond school where young people learn what it is to be a young citizen, where they play and perform, what motivations underlie those spaces, how do they work? So in my fieldwork, I've tried to look at essentially uniformed youth movements and a few religious youth clubs as well. And the fact that these are often voluntary spaces is incredibly significant. How do volunteers shape the moral geographies of these spaces? Who is allowed? What activities are seen as good or bad? What ideas about childhood and at the same time kind of citizens of tomorrow are being espoused in these spaces. So today I'm going to focus on the Boy Scouts, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So I will give some context, but then I'll move quite quickly into talking about the citizenship model of scouting in the first half of the paper. And in the second half of the paper, I'm going to talk about how that model that was created was really challenged or stretched in the early 1950s through some Boy Scouts that were also members of the Young Communist League and were excluded. So there's a bit of controversy thrown in for good measure. So I'm sure some of you will be familiar with the context I'm going to outline in the next minute or so. Several historians have focused on the scouting and guiding movements. Tammy Proctor, Alan Warren, Tim Geel, Jay Meshling, Timothy Parsons, Michael Rosenthal, and more recently Christine Alexander. So I'll outline the foundations of the scouting here, and it's quite obvious how historians have utilised the case study because of scouting's links to empire, gender and nationhood. So Robert Baden-Powell's conceptualization of scouting began during his service in the Boer War, where he witnessed young boys assisting soldiers with small observation tasks, or scouting. His method was developed as a scheme for youth over a number of years. He developed this through public lectures, correspondence, and he piloted his methods at an experimental camp in August 1907 at Brownsea Island in Dorset. Following the camp, he refined this method and he published his ideas in Scouting for Boys, which was originally a kind of series of magazine supplements rather than a standalone text. But it became the original blueprint of scouting. The Chief Scout, as he was later termed, was kind of motivated by a number of class-based Edwardian anxieties about the state of the nation and the future of the British Empire. The Boer War in particular had exposed kind of the physical weaknesses of the British Army, raised fears about the possible decline of Britain's imperial power if left in the hands of unhealthy and kind of lacklustre male youth. So scouting was being promoted as kind of able to stem the tide almost. And we can relate this to a number of kind of contemporary examples where youth is mobilised as a powerful metaphor for hope in the face of anxieties, insecurities and unknown possible futures. So through scouting, BP, as I'll term him from now on, his scheme aimed to develop the physical, mental and spiritual life of the boy on the road to adulthood through outdoor education and training in woodcraft. And the sheer popularity of scouting at a grassroots level meant that the Boy Scouts Association was officially formalised in 1908. Some age-based guidelines were introduced. Scouts were approximately 10 to 15-year-olds at first, with sections for younger and older boys introduced in due course. So scouting today has 5 sections, ages from 6 right up until 25. The Girl Guides was founded in 1910, and that has its own kind of genealogical development that I've written about elsewhere. Scouting quickly expanded from Britain to imperial and Commonwealth nations and further afield with the establishment of the World Organisation of the Scout Movement in 1920, and it is currently the largest youth organisation in the world with over 200 national organisations. Now, most of the studies from historians that I listed earlier have tended to focus on this early history, the origins, the camp, scouting for boys and so on. And I guess what I've tried to do, if only in part, is offer a geographical reading of the archive that seeks to uncover some of young people's voices or agency within this organisation as well. And to really interrogate this notion of youth citizenship. How was that talked about in its early years, but then how has it been challenged subsequently? Okay, so moving on to Citizen Scout then, as I've termed this talk. This is a statue that sits outside the official headquarters in Gilwell Park in Essex. It's often called the Ideal Scout, sometimes it's referred to as the Boy Scout, and to me it kind of encapsulates what was seen as this early image. It was a gift from the Boy Scouts of America, in fact, in the 30s. But I would argue that the primary objective of the Scout movement has been to train and guide youth into adult citizenry, whilst at the same time fixing a kind of proper place for children in the present where their behaviour could be governed and they could contribute both as individuals and collectively through a kind of emasculated version of citizenship. And citizenship has consistently featured as the central aim of scouting. You can track it through all the times they've looked at their aims and their policies right up until today, although often the words that they use have changed. So now they promote global citizenship, sustainable citizenship, but active citizenship is something that's always been there. So Baden-Powell sustained the belief with conviction that through scouting, young people in Britain and abroad could become better citizens. So here he says, the aim of the Scout training is to improve the standard of our future citizenhood, especially in character and health, to replace self with service, to make the lads individually efficient, morally and physically, with the object of using that efficiency for service for their fellow men. So here, citizenship is attached to the notion of character, which is a kind of popular idea in early 20th century Britain, entwined with a kind of stirring masculinised qualities. He believed scouting would, and I quote, turn the rising generation on the right road for good citizenship. And in directing them on that journey, he provided some clear examples of what he kind of described as good citizens, rather than always offering kind of negative critiques. So he told adventurous stories of King Arthur, John Smith, describing various men of empire, we could term them, as scouts of the nation. And he would intermesh these stories in something like Scouting for Boys with very practical skills, kind of how to tie knots, camping and so on. The Chief Scout was mounting a direct challenge to his readership and kind of we can see a moral geography of values really inscribed on the body in order to restore the nation's strength. So this model of youth citizenship was clearly articulated in those early texts, and it revolved around 3 central components, and these are still seen as the fundamentals of scouting today in their policies, which are duty to self, duty to others, and duty to God. So duty to self focused on the idea of self-discipline, regulation of the self, as he explained, a man who can control himself, his anger, his fear, his temptations, everything in fact, except his conscience and his shame. That man is well on his way to being a gentleman. And this notion of a regulated, self-governed subject ties into some broader debates on subjectification and conduct, and in particular on the position of youth as governable citizen subjects. The second tenet of the module, duty to others, referred to a Scout's responsibilities for his local neighbours, fellow Britons and some imagined others of the empire. And that's embodied in the practice of what was called doing a good turn, which still exists today, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And finally, the third strand, duty to God, Baden-Powell described as attaining the status of a future citizen of heaven. Now, religion has always been a contentious issue in Scouting, but an element of faith was seen by the Chief Scout as an essential part of that kind of obligation. And it is a unique approach in terms of British youth movements at this time that Baden-Powell had around a Scout fulfilling their obligation to their faith or their parents' faith or belief, not necessarily Christian or Anglican in particular, and that leaders should accommodate non-Christian members. And I think this complicates the stereotype that we tend to have of the organisation as Christian. So some of my other research has focused on Muslim Scouting and early Jewish Scouting. And you may have heard on the news more recently, there's been a series of debates about atheism in Scouting and guiding as well. So these three elements, duty to self, others and God, expresses a kind of utilitarian concept of citizenship, where Scouts are kind of universalised as Scouts, as individuals working for the greater good, as outlined by Sophie Whitman's in an edited volume from 2009. But I'd also argue there's kind of two separate projects at play here. First, that Scouts develop as that self-regulated, duty-bound individual that I've outlined. And secondly, to create a kind of collective body of Scouts with a real sense of belonging and membership. So members were united through things like the Scout salute, the Scout sign. The Scout sign here is supposed to represent duty to self, others and God, with those three tenets that I mentioned earlier. And the left handshake, things that I've termed kind of cultures of embodied movement. They were a kind of insider's prize knowledge, and one example how this idea of inclusion between members was generated. Furthermore, those ideas that I've outlined about duty to self in particular were seen as very much run through the body. So one example of this is the Scout motto, be prepared, still the Scout motto today, which Baden-Powell explained that you were always in a state of readiness in mind and body to do your duty. So he says here, be prepared in mind by having disciplined yourself to be obedient in every order, and also by having thought out beforehand any accident or situation that might occur, so that you know the right thing to do at the right moment and are willing to do it. Be prepared in body by making yourself strong and active and able to do the right thing at the right moment, and do it. So be prepared wasn't just this mere slogan, that's what I'm trying to get at here. It was communicated as an embodied practice that you should anticipate it, and it hints at the responsibilities that may be afforded to Scouts, that there might be an accident that they have to help with, and so they should be ready for it. On the one hand then, Baden-Powell believed those participating in this scheme would be well-rounded and good citizens when they were a future adult. But on the other hand, that they had responsibilities as young citizens in the here and now. So he stressed passive citizenship is not enough, only active citizenship will do. And these notions were very much central to the programme, which revolved around things like camping, hiking, cooking, cleaning, crafting, regular parts, these types of skills that the kind of authorities felt that Scouts needed in order to do their duty. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to thinking about volunteers in all of this. And in terms of the practicalities of Scouting, early troops met regularly and taught themselves. So there's very much accounts of friends getting hold of a copy of Scouting for Boys, and sometimes that included mixed groups and girls getting their hands on Scouting for Boys, but very much young people getting hold of the book and scouting for themselves. However, accounts then talk about them co-opting an adult to help and guide them, whether that was their father, an uncle, a cousin, their mom in some cases, or young groups then getting caught up in the institutional culture of Scouting as the association emerged and things became more regulated. So Scouters, which is the collective term for adult volunteers in Scouting, were seen as experts that disseminated knowledge to youth on the ground and generated senses of citizenship, or were seen to generate senses of citizenship, most powerfully in rural spaces. And the Scouters' role was influential, and it was talked about in early guidebooks as very influential because they were a regular feature in the Boy Scouts' life, as opposed to Baden-Powell, who was ultimately out of reach. You know, he was the kind of celebrity within that. Scouters were formally trained by the association and made aware of their role, which is expressed in one of these early handbooks here as the Scoutmaster's conjuring trick. So he's seen as a magician. So acting on behalf of Baden-Powell, Scouters were seen to be able to perform a trick of turning an unkempt and unhealthy individual into a proud, clean and upright Scout, man and citizen. They were also seen as ultimately responsible for the success of Scouting. So here's Baden-Powell saying, well, Scouting is a medicine composed of various ingredients, and unless they're mixed in their proper proportions, according to the prescription, the users must not blame the doctor if the effects on the patient are unsatisfactory. So volunteers were accountable then for mixing this prescription for British youth at a grassroots level. So far we have this image of an ideal citizen scout, a duty-bound, self-regulated individual that would contribute as part of a wider collective body of British youth. And this was communicated in lots of different ways. So scout badges delivered via volunteers and marked by volunteers, observed and assessed. Camps, outdoor adventure, but also visual images, things like magazines. Junior fiction was incredibly popular in the 20s and 30s, and films. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the Scout Promise and Law as one clear example of where we see that geography, a moral geography of good and bad. Okay, so at Investiture, or Enrollment, which is the ceremony that transforms an individual into a scout when they join a local group, a young person makes the following verbal declaration, which is on my honour, I promise to do my best, to do my duty to God and the Queen, to help other people and to keep the Scout law. And this promise would then be repeated at various ceremonies. It's often seen as the most sacred part of Scouting philosophy. There are lots of accounts in the archive and elsewhere where people later on in life have described that Scout promise as a kind of moral compass for their life. Similarly, there's lots of accounts of the Scout promise being changed wording, children messing about, being bored, changing the words, holding kind of their hands behind their back so that they don't really mean it. Okay, so there's lots of different ways the promise has been interpreted. The Scout law that it refers to in that last line I've put up here, this is the original from Scouting for Boys, but over the years it's largely remained similar to this. The last few have disappeared, but the first few have pretty much remained central, which is around Scouts honour being trusted, about being loyal, duty-bound, useful, helping others. Those themes have really remained, and they were a popular way of simplifying adult messages for young people in a kind of communicable form, a list of things that we should Scouts live up to. And the notion of living up to the Scout law was strongly advocated by the organisation, often by giving an example of really kind of immoral law, so gangs, especially in the kind of 20s and 30s. You see this in those junior Scout novels that I mentioned. So here's a quote from a junior Scout novel called Rivals of Parnham, where Eric Ames, the Scout, is arguing with a gang leader called Dizzy. So it says, Ames shook himself free as Dizzy's arms. I came to tell you that I won't do you as you ask, he said spiritedly. I'm a Scout, and though I haven't been properly enrolled yet, I've got to live up to the laws. And then it says, Dizzy laughed coarsely. You don't believe in that silly rot, that's only for saps. Real blokes don't want no laws laid down for them, they make their own laws. And Eric says, well, you say that because, well, you couldn't live up to any decent laws. Okay, so there's lots of attacks of the idealised Boy Scout. Okay, so somebody, a kind of animated figure of the statue we saw earlier. And there's always a kind of gang leader around, and that the two are often pitted against one another. Now, although the law could be seen as just a suggestive code of conduct with no real repercussions, the example I'm going to give later is where certain types of behaviour or beliefs were judged unlawful by the organisation, and members were excluded on those grounds of the law that we just saw. So although it's only suggested and it's kind of a bit jokey in the novels, actually the Scout law was referred to a lot in cases of exclusion. There were also shorter versions. Okay, so the Cub Scout law is a Cub Scout always does his best, thinks of others before himself, and does a good turn every day. And they use this example of a good turn as a very practical application of the Scout law, a daily act of kindness to somebody. So here collecting groceries, and here making an emergency phone call. And elements of these are still seen today in the programme. And when he stressed the importance of a good turn, BP again turned to some historic tales of kind of heroism in his eyes. So he said, you Scouts cannot do better than follow the example of your forefathers, the Knights. Every day they had to do a good turn to somebody, and that is one of our rules. When you get up in the morning, tie a knot in your handkerchief or necktie to remind yourself of it, and when you go to bed at night, think who you did the good turn to. So I'd argue this temporal aspect of completing a good turn every day, using a kind of material aid to remember, was important in encouraging citizenly-like behaviours outside of Scouting, so whether that's at the home, the street, the neighbourhood, and so on. So through mechanisms such as the good turn, Scouts became emblematic of a good, law-abiding young citizen, and the public image meant that Boy Scouts, and more broadly the organisation, seemed to represent certain values and also expectations. So what I found quite interesting in the archive was the amount of times that Baden-Powell had been written to by members of the public who were kind of unimpressed with some Boy Scouts that they'd encountered, whether that was on the street or in shops or whatever. So here's a request from the Secretary of the King George and Queen Mary Club for Overseas Forces in 1918, who wrote to Baden-Powell and said, we feel we would like to convey to you how disappointing some of the boys are on occasions, when we'd expect more from them than from others. For instance, continually lately in the underground and in buses, women give up their seats to crippled soldiers or women with babies, while Boy Scouts sit. It is a bad example, and if they could hear what people think, they would not be flattered. So these types of criticism reflect the perceived risk of a bad ambassador for Scouting, and broader tensions, I think, about class in the Scout movement. Ideas about what is Scout-like behaviour can also be seen in the instruction booklets for volunteers that stress their role as an adult instructor in moulding the right type of Boy Scout. So here's one that says, when a Scout in uniform carries out a small act of service in public, observers will say to themselves, good types these Boy Scouts. If another Scout were to throw his weight about, barge his way to the head of a bus queue, bag a seat and leave a lady standing, the rest of the passengers could not be blamed for thinking the worst about Scout training. Also, the physical appearance of a Boy Scout was seen as very important in terms of maintaining that reputation. So again, this is in a volunteer's handbook. It says, a senior Scout might be kind, they might be helpful, trustworthy and all the rest. But if he went around with unkempt hair, in a scruffy uniform, with shorts turned up 3 parts up to his thighs, beret on the back of his head, and shuffling along with his hands in his pocket, and I'm sorry to say I've seen a few types knocking about the streets of London and seaside resorts during the holiday season, members of the public would undoubtedly think, some Scout, the movement isn't what it was. So here, scruffy Scouts are positioned in particular geographical spaces, urban London and kind of brash seaside resorts, locations infused with class-based stereotypes. So we can see how a moral landscape of youth citizenship and ideas on behaviour were communicated through that Scout law, and furthermore how the law was translated into some performances that were required to maintain the commitment of Scouts outside of the Scout hut. So that's where this idea around space comes into play. How am I doing for time? Okay, what I want to turn to now then, in the kind of second half here, is something I hinted at earlier about what happens when there's an alternative vision of who Citizen Scout is, and how adult volunteers negotiate that boundary between who's seen as a good Scout and who's seen as a bad Scout at a local level. So to do so, I'm going to fast forward somewhat. I'm conscious I'm traversing a kind of raft of social and economic changes here, up until the early 1950s. So in 1954, there was a very specific case that essentially asked, can a communist be a true scout? And the full paper, as I've said, it is here. I haven't got the time to outline the kind of early context of this, which is that in the 1920s, there were some divisions between Scouting and the Young Communist League, and a lot of it was directed at Baden-Powell. But in 1954, Baden-Powell had been dead since 1941. There was a new chief scout. This kind of came out of the blue somewhat, but it can also be put in the context of McCarthyism, and I'll hint at that as I go through. So in 1954, a quite unique case that demonstrated these ideas about the good and bad scouting citizen, and particularly this moral framework about the law and promise, and that's why I kind of outlined it earlier. So, Paul Garland, a 19-year-old toolmaker from Bristol in England, had been part of his scout group since the age of 8, and he'd achieved the highest award for any young person in scouting, the Queen Scout Award. Now, his communist kind of leanings, if we can call them that, and attendance at some Communist League events had been known to his scoutmaster for a number of months, about 4 or 5 months, and kind of just let happen. But in February 1954, he was interviewed by his local newspaper because he'd been appointed as the district secretary for the Young Communist League. And this institutional confirmation of his political beliefs was deemed to be a step too far. So his scoutmaster expelled him from the scout group, demanded his uniform and badges back. And then what happened throughout the whole of spring, really, was this debate about his appeal, whether he could come back into the scout group. So whilst his communist beliefs had previously been tolerated by a volunteer, by his scout leader, on the understanding that they were kept hidden, once he was exposed through this newspaper article and made visible as a Red Scout, he was dismissed. Following the expulsion, he defiantly attended his local scout group's pantomime, which was ironically entitled Little Red Riding Hood. And he gave this interview stating, "I'm going to appeal, I'm not giving my badges back." And so the private, volunteer-led dismissal of Garland then became this national and very public affair. He recorded a broadcast for the BBC, and this was controversially banned the night before it was due to air, because a number of Conservative MPs wrote to the BBC and sent telegrams that it shouldn't be played. So I think that's perhaps emblematic of the kind of BBC's policy on communism at the time, and its perceived role as the voice of the establishment, perhaps. Garland's dismissal caused a real divide within the Scout Association. So letters of support and condemnation were sent to Lord Rowland, who was the second Chief Scout since Baden-Powell. And the Young Communist League mounted this immediate campaign against the Scouts to reverse this dismissal. And also, Garland's campaign was taken up by a member of the House of Lords, Vice Scout Stansgate, William Wedgwood Benn, which is Tony Benn's father. Okay, so he took up this campaign. There's some fascinating letters about this in the parliamentary archives. And this debate lasted about 4 hours, kind of back and forth about what the Scouts meant and should Garland have been dismissed, basically, on this local level. It then became very national. However, the appeal in Bristol failed. He never went back to scouting, and Garland remained a committed member of the Young Communist League for the rest of his youth. He then became a Labour supporter, county councillor, and at the time of his death in 1999, he was deputy mayor of Bristol. So having outlined the case study, I just want to run through 3 points, really, of kind of analysis. The first is about the geographies of exclusion that Garland encountered. The second is the role of volunteers in this whole case. And then finally, I want to talk about the alternative side of scouting here, alternative acts of citizenship. So first then, this case revolved around some really complicated geographies of exclusion to justify his dismissal. Throughout the appeal, there was a long-running debate about whether he was a good or bad Boy Scout, and this revealed some competing visions about who or what a good young British citizen should have been. So headquarters constructed him as a bad scout unworthy of membership who had broken his promise. And although the Boy Scouts is non-political, the question boils down to this: can a member faithfully fulfil his scout promise to do his duty to God and the Queen? Now, this official response was kind of suggesting to other Boy Scouts that the authorities would somehow be monitoring or passing judgment over whether a promise they maybe made when they were 8 years old, was still being kept at the age of 18, 19 years old for various different behaviours. And this was very troubling to some volunteers in Scouting who saw the dismissal as a witch hunt in an era of McCarthyism. So one asked, are you or the leaders prepared to paint your pointed scout hat midnight black and sit on the investigating committee prodding broomsticks into any of us who you might care to think have slipped upon the oath? Now, as a bad Boy Scout, he was also seen as an immediate threat to other youth. The Chief Scout said, surely we're not to keep one boy whom we've lost all hope of helping, but at the same time risk the danger of harming those whom we are leading to a belief in God. For others, though, he was a good Scout. He'd done all the Scout competitions, he possessed all those skills of a Boy Scout that were outlined earlier in this paper, and that politics was nothing to do with it. His supporters said that his politics was the concern of the individual, not that of the movement, with one volunteer writing in saying, look, I don't see any rule here referring to political views, except that in uniform they do not participate. And if you're going to start banning communists, well, what about Conservatives, Liberals and Labour? And Mr. Martin really here had raised a valid point. The rules didn't make any reference to specific political parties or indeed communists, but you couldn't take an official political activity, undertake a political activity in uniform. However, Paul never did his league activities in Scout uniform. It was just kind of assumed. So I think this case reveals how the organisation never saw an individual, certainly at this time, as independent of that organisation, that there was always some element in which you were always a Scout. And, for the Young Communist League, they never saw a problem that Garland was a Scout and belonged to their organisation too. However, there's no mistaking that the Young Communist League absolutely latched onto this. They did a massive publicity stunt around it and used it as a recruitment strategy, so it kind of played into their hands as well. Garland was also talked about as a diseased communist threat, and I quote, planting cells that would eat away at the body. And a few geographers like Tim Creswell and David Sibley have talked about metaphors of disease and contamination to justify exclusion in a number of cases, and I think we can see that here. He became representative of a wider communist threat to British values and society, and many believed that if communists could kind of get into or appear within the Scouts, then nothing was sacred. It was described in that Lord's debate as the Scouts was as emblematic, a metaphor for the British nation. If the communists could infiltrate the Scouts, they are at the heart of what is seen to be British. So the Red Scout affair, as I've kind of termed it, further cemented this youth movement as a very romanticised part of the British way of life. And without Garland amongst its ranks, it could continue to represent a particular type of politics and idealistic vision of British youth. The second brief point I want to make about this case study is that there were a few other cases of Red Scouts at this time. So once, the media had found one Red Scout, there were several others that were exposed, particularly in the Birmingham area. But what's interesting is that each Scout group had a very different response. So some Scoutmaster said, yeah, I've got no problem with it, they can stay. Others, they were completely dismissed and excluded, such as Paul. Others had a kind of halfway house that was kind of getting them to agree not to influence other young people, but they could still appear, or they could appear but they could never be a leader, okay, or these type of things. Now, this bureaucratic kind of inconsistency, you could term it, highlights the differential ways that those close to the boys at the grassroots level thought about their Scouts in an everyday sense, the ways they were willing sometimes to overlook political affiliation or difference, and these policies, things like this booklet about how communism was a challenge to Scouting. The difference, I guess, between the local and the national scale here, I think the Chief Scout, he saw himself as that central figure, as emblematic for the bigger picture, whereas volunteers were very important in terms of how Scouting really operated at the everyday, regional, but also local level. And the final point about what I think this Garland affair really tells us is about that project of Scouting encouraging active citizens, because during his appeal, he drew on the cultures and infrastructures of Scouting. Garland basically said, that the two were compatible, that they were very idealistic. He saw all these connections that maybe Baden-Powell hadn't seen. So he was trying to rewrite, in a way, how they were compatible. He mobilised supporters, he attended lots of scout events, he enlisted other Boy Scouts from nearby scout huts to defend his appeal. And so he was a visible, articulate and kind of troubling figure, a thorn in the side of the movement at this time. So I would argue that there's kind of counter-public spaces in which acts of citizenship can occur. These aren't limited to adulthood. They can be orchestrated by young people themselves. I guess it shows really how young people can take an alternative meaning from these perceived fixed aims of something like a youth organisation and can read something differently into the Scout Promise and Law that I outlined earlier. The organisation saw Paul and his way of being a Boy Scout as a threat to their reputation and their success, and their role as a producer of good young British citizens. So in conclusion, I think the paper has explored how youth citizenship was originally employed and enacted in the Scouts, that original model Scout laid out in the formative years of Scouting, and how that's been used as a barometer to judge Scouting behaviours and personalities throughout the movement's history, most notably during some times of tension, change in its membership and responses to social difference. So despite some of that cohesive rhetoric at the start of the paper that everybody was a Scout, everybody could be a Scout, notions of duty and citizenship, Scouts were still very much divided by struggles about belonging, whether that was political, whether that's religious or gendered, as I've kind of hinted at. By defining who the ideal Scout was, Baden-Powell was subsequently defining who could not be a Scout. At that time, girls or atheists, but obviously some of those ideas have changed over time. Whilst the organisation might be viewed then as a kind of very stable, bounded space, where Scouts might play out a particular prescribed identity, I'd argue that it's a much more fluid space, that it brings together diverse individuals and diverse histories, several of which have been hidden histories, for example, the communism case study, but also around non-Christian groups. So hopefully this paper's given an insight into a geographical engagement with a voluntary youth space and its philosophies and practices. Thank you very much for listening.